Well, it is a historic agreement, indeed, because as was said there, that this is the first time that the two parties have signed any kind of deal, and it's the first kind of agreement between parties on the very fractured and divided French left for a very long time indeed. I mean, you'll recall that in the first round of the presidential elections, there were half a dozen candidates on the French left. Between them, they collected more than enough votes to go through to the second round if they had all been represented by one candidate. Of course, they weren't. And so none of them did make it through, not even Jean-Luc Mélenchon, although he came very close.
Do you think this alliance, the like of which I haven't seen myself in my time here in France, I mean, do you think it's the sort of thing that would perhaps inspire other parties to do the same thing? We might perhaps see a right-wing alliance, or do you think that's just not workable?
Well, I think a lot depends. I mean, the goal, of course, on the left is for a much broader alliance than just the Greens and La France Insoumise. The broad left is looking to include the Socialist Party and the Communists. Although, as yet, there's still a lot of reticence and a lot of resistance, particularly among some of the sort of more senior members of the Socialist Party to this tie-up. I mean, the Socialist Party really hasn't been speaking in particular to Jean-Luc Mélenchon and the France Insoumise for many years now, and accuses Mélenchon of basically wanting to take revenge on the Socialist Party after leaving it himself a few years ago. But I mean, I think alliances are clearly going to be necessary, and they're going to be necessary in all three of these blocks that we're seeing emerging in French politics in the run-up to and since the presidential elections. We have this left-wing bloc dominated by the hard left France Unbowed and Jean-Luc Mélenchon. We have a far-right bloc dominated, obviously, at the moment by Marine Le Pen, that might or might not be joined by the Reconquer or Reconquête party that led by Eric Zemmour, and may also be joined by sort of more hardline elements of the centre-right Les Républicains party. And of course, there's President Macron's centrist bloc that was already joined by sort of more centrist socialist politicians in his previous term, and may now also be joined by some of the more centrist members of the Les Républicains party. So there's really a wholesale kind of redrawing of the French political landscape that's underway, and alliances will necessarily be part of that in the run-up to and after the legislative elections.
Yeah, and just to be clear, if Macron doesn't get a majority in June, if his party doesn't get a majority, he won't be able to do quite a lot of the things he wants to do, will he? Not least that pro-business reform agenda that he's got.
That's right. I mean, French presidents have, by sort of international standards, a lot of power, but their power is distinctly limited if they don't have a majority in Parliament, and if it's a presidential mandate that ends up in, as the French call it, in cohabitation with a Parliament of another kind of political colour. Macron would certainly find himself hamstrung. It's really much too early to say whether that is the likely outcome at the moment. I mean, we've seen the first few polls starting to come out, some of which have suggested that Macron's movement and its allies could get a reasonably comfortable majority, some of them suggesting that the left might be the largest alliance in Parliament. But it's very, very difficult to say, quite simply because these are polls on a national scale, and you really need to start drilling down into constituency levels to try and work out exactly, who will be running against whom, because quite often there will be alliances and and candidates will stand aside in specific constituencies to avoid, somebody from an opposing party winning. And so polling for the legislative elections is really very complicated to do, certainly until after the first round. So I think it's a bit early to say yet exactly what makeup Parliament will have. But we can definitely say that there will have to be alliances, and that if Macron doesn't have a clear majority, then life will be quite a bit more complicated for him.
And just lastly, John, I mean, looking at your screen during the course of Sunday, I mean, what did those May Day demonstrations, the quite violent scenes, say to you about the current mood here in France?
I think it's wrong to draw kind of instant conclusions. They were, for the most part, they were completely peaceful demonstrations. And what we saw, most of the arrests were, as far as I can see, of these so-called black bloc demonstrators who are, basically troublemakers who show up at demonstrations in France and have been doing so for years, and with the express purpose of causing as much damage as they can. But that shouldn't distract from the fact that there is clearly a lot of anger and a lot of resistance to, particularly to Emmanuel Macron's pension plans. The recent polls have shown something like 70% of the French are opposed to his plan to raise the retirement age progressively to 65. And that is going to be a problem for him. And there's going to be a lot of explaining that has to be done, even if the French are really outliers on this. I mean, pretty much every other European country either has its retirement age set now at 65 or is on the way to it. And there are quite a few, Britain included, which are already at 66 or 67 and expect to be up even at 68 within the next 10 years. So, I think a lot of Europe looks on this debate in France with a little bit of sort of bewilderment. But the fact remains, there's clearly a lot of people who are upset about this plan.